Inside Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, one mispronounced word was about to cost a man his life. The city's most ruthless syndicate boss was seconds away from a brutal execution until a 24-year-old waitress dropped her tray, stepped into the crossfire, and commanded him to stop. In flawless Japanese. The atmosphere inside the Wellington, a Michelin-starred establishment nestled off Rush Street in downtown Chicago, was usually one of refined, impenetrable calm. Tonight, however, the air was thick enough to choke on. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the slick, neon-lit pavement. But the real storm was brewing inside the private dining suite, known as the Obsidian Room. Lydia Monroe stood by the mahogany service station, her fingers gripping the edge of a silver tray, so tightly her knuckles were white. She was 24, with quiet, unassuming features, dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, and a pristine white uniform that felt more like a straitjacket tonight. She was supposed to be invisible. That was the golden rule of the Wellington. You poured the vintage Bordeaux, you served the dry-aged Wagyu, and you did not exist. But tonight, invisibility was a matter of survival. The reservation had been made under a ghost name, a shell corporation with infinite funds, when the manager Gregory, a usually unflappable man with 20 years of hospitality experience at the Waldorf and the St. Regis, saw the black Escalades pull up, all the color drained from his face. "Nobody looks directly at the head of the table," Gregory had hissed to the staff in the kitchen pantry just 10 minutes prior. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not hover." The man who had commandeered the Obsidian Room was Vincent Hayes. To the Chicago Tribune and the local authorities, Vincent Hayes was a phantom, a billionaire venture capitalist with hands in shipping and real estate. But to those who understood the dark underbelly of the international black market, Vincent was something much more terrifying. He was the Oyabun, the absolute head of the Kansai Syndicate's Western Division. Born to American diplomats, but orphaned and raised in the brutal, fiercely traditional underworld of Osaka, Vincent was a terrifying paradox. He possessed striking Western features, a sharp, aristocratic jawline, dark hair styled immaculately, and piercing ice-blue eyes. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that hugged his broad shoulders, and the platinum Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the dim chandelier light. Yet he operated strictly under the ruthless codes of the Japanese Mafia. He commanded absolute loyalty, and he punished disrespect with lethal permanence. Vincent sat at the head of the long oak table, surrounded by 6 heavily armed enforcers. Among them were his top lieutenants, Gideon and Felix men, whose tailored suits couldn't hide the dangerous coiled spring tension in their bodies. Across from Vincent sat Dominic Rossi, a notoriously hot-headed capo of the local Italian outfit. They were here to negotiate a highly volatile shipping port treaty, and right in the middle of this powder keg was Bradley. Bradley was a freelance corporate interpreter, hired by Dominic Rossi to bridge the language gap. Vincent Hayes, despite his American blood, refused to speak English during syndicate business. It was a power play, a psychological weapon that forced his enemies to play by his cultural rules. As Lydia approached the table to refill the crystal water glasses, she kept her eyes glued to the tablecloth. But her ears were wide open. Lydia had a secret. Before she was a waitress in Chicago, before her father, William Monroe, had died of a sudden heart attack in a run-down apartment they had spent 10 years hiding in the sprawling, neon-soaked wards of Osaka. Her father had been a disgraced accountant running from his own demons, and Lydia had grown up completely immersed in the streets of Japan. She didn't just know textbook Japanese. She knew the slang, the honorifics, the subtle inflections of the Kansai dialect, and the dangerous, clipped tones of the Yakuza. Vincent leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He spoke in a low, gravelly baritone. The syllables were sharp, rhythmic, and deadly quiet. "The docks on the south side belong to us," Vincent said, in flawless, terrifying Japanese. "You may use them for your transit, but my men oversee the cargo. Any deviation from this arrangement will be considered an act of war." Lydia swallowed hard, her hand trembling slightly as she poured sparkling water into Gideon's glass. She understood every single word. Vincent's tone was absolute. It left zero room for negotiation. Dominic, chewing on a cigar, glanced impatiently at Bradley. "Well, what did the suit say?" Bradley, sweating profusely and clearly out of his depth, loosened his silk tie. He had learned corporate Japanese, polite, sterile boardroom Japanese. He did not understand the heavy Kansai underworld dialect, nor did he grasp the lethal nuances of Vincent's phrasing. Bradley stammered, wiping his brow. "He says that they want the South Docks, but they are willing to share the oversight with your men to keep the peace." Lydia froze. The silver pitcher in her hand stopped tilting. No, Lydia thought, her heart slamming against her ribs. No, that is not what he said at all. Dominic smirked, leaning back in his leather chair. "Share oversight. See now, that's what I'm talking about. Tell Hayes we have a deal, but my boys hold the keys to the storage units." Bradley turned to Vincent and began to translate Dominic's counteroffer. But Bradley's Japanese was clumsy. Worse, in his panic, he dropped the Kigo, the strict, formal honorifics required when addressing a syndicate boss. He spoke to Vincent Hayes, using a casual, almost dismissive verb conjugation, the kind a person might use with a subordinate. The temperature in the obsidian room plummeted to sub-zero. Lydia saw Gideon's hand drift beneath his suit jacket. Felix shifted his weight, his eyes locking onto Bradley with the cold detachment of a butcher looking at a slab of meat. Vincent did not blink. His ice-blue eyes slowly dragged away from Dominic and fixed onto Bradley. The silence that followed was so profound, so heavy, that the sound of the rain hitting the window suddenly sounded like gunfire. "You!" Vincent whispered in Japanese, the word dripping with venom. "You dare speak to me with the tongue of a peasant. You twist my terms and insult my house." Bradley blinked, completely oblivious to the death sentence that had just been handed down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I didn't catch that last part. Could you repeat?" Vincent didn't look at Bradley again. He simply gave a microscopic nod to Gideon. Gideon rose from his chair, moving with terrifying speed, drawing a suppressed firearm from his shoulder holster. Gregory, the manager, who was standing by the door, let out a strangled gasp. Dominic's men shot to their feet, reaching for their own weapons. Chaos was exactly 2 seconds away from erupting in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant. A massacre was about to happen. And before she could stop herself, before her survival instincts could staple her feet to the floor, Lydia stepped directly between the Mafia Boss and the interpreter. The heavy silver water pitcher hit the mahogany table with a sharp, resounding clack. Every gun in the room snapped toward Lydia. Gideon's suppressed barrel was aimed directly at her chest. Felix had a blade out, flashing under the chandelier light. Dominic's men were shouting, but their voices sounded like a muted underwater echo to Lydia. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't look at the terrified interpreter or the panicked manager by the door. She looked directly into the ice-blue eyes of Vincent Hayes, breaking every rule of the restaurant and every rule of self-preservation she had learned on the streets of Osaka. Lydia bowed. It was a precise, deep 45-degree bow, demonstrating perfect, unwavering respect. When she straightened, she spoke. Her voice was steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Give this profound intrusion, Hayes-sama," Lydia said. The words left her lips in flawless, aristocratic Kego. Not the rough street slang she used as a teenager, but the elevated, deeply respectful language reserved for the highest echelons of Japanese society. Her pronunciation was native, holding the subtle melodic undertones of the Kansai region. Vincent's eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only sign of his absolute foundation-rocking shock. Gideon hesitated, his finger pausing on the trigger. Felix lowered his blade slightly. The men who, only seconds ago, were ready to paint the walls red were now completely paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. A young American waitress in a pristine apron was speaking high-level syndicate Japanese to their oyabun. Lydia didn't stop. She couldn't afford to, or she would be dead. The translator is incompetent, Lydia continued in Japanese, keeping her tone smooth and deferential, yet projecting a quiet authority. He has gravely insulted your honor through his ignorance, not his malice. More importantly, he has mistranslated your terms to Rossi-san. If blood is spilled tonight, it will be over the foolish mistakes of a hired tongue, not a true breach of business. Vincent stared at her. For 10 long seconds, the room hung in a terrifying limbo. He studied her face, taking in her pale skin, her dark brown eyes, the slight tremble in her hands that she was fighting desperately to suppress. "Who are you?" Vincent asked, his voice a dangerous velvet whisper in Japanese. "I am nobody, Hayes-sama. Merely a servant of this house," Lydia replied, immediately refusing to break eye contact. "But I know what you said. You said your men oversee the cargo. Absolute control. No deviations." Vincent slowly raised a hand. At the gesture, Gideon lowered his weapon and stepped back. Felix sheathed his knife. The suffocating tension in the room dialed back just enough to let oxygen return. Vincent switched his gaze to Dominic, who was looking between the waitress and the boss with utter bewilderment. "Your interpreter is a dead man walking," Vincent said in English, his voice smooth, carrying an icy Midwestern accent that shocked Dominic even more than the Japanese had. "He disrespected me. And he lied to you. I did not offer shared oversight, Rossi. I offered you permission to exist on my docks. Nothing more." Dominic's face flushed dark red. He turned furiously to Bradley, who was currently hyperventilating against the wall. "Get out!" Dominic snarled at the interpreter. "Get out before I kill you myself!" Bradley scrambled for the door, practically shoving past the paralyzed restaurant manager. Vincent stood up. He was a towering figure, radiating a dark, magnetic power. He walked slowly around the edge of the oak table until he was standing mere inches from Lydia. Up close, he smelled of cedarwood rain and cold metal. Lydia forced herself not to step back. She held her ground, though her heart was beating so hard she felt dizzy. Vincent looked down at her. "You saved a man's life tonight," he said, speaking English now. His tone was impossible to read. "And you risked your own to do it. Why?" "I don't like messes in my dining room, sir." Lydia said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Blood is terribly hard to get out of the carpets." A suffocating beat of silence passed, and then a deep, resonant sound rumbled in Vincent's chest. He was laughing. It was a dark, genuine chuckle that made Gideon and Felix exchange stunned looks. Their boss never laughed during business. Vincent leaned in slightly, his face dangerously close to hers. When he spoke again, it was back in the Kansai dialect, intimate and probing. "A gaijin waitress in Chicago with the tongue of an Osaka ghost," Vincent murmured. "You have my attention, little bird. What is your name?" "Lydia," she answered softly in Japanese. "Lydia Monroe." Vincent nodded slowly, his ice-blue eyes burning into hers. He turned his head slightly toward the door. "Gregory." The manager flinched, stepping forward with his hands clasped together, looking like he was walking to the gallows. Yes, Mr. Hayes. Miss Monroe is no longer serving food tonight, Vincent commanded. He didn't ask. He dictated reality. She is sitting at this table. She is my new interpreter for the remainder of these negotiations. Whatever she is being paid for this shift, add 3 zeros to it. Bill it to my account. Gregory's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Sir, company policy. Vincent shot Gregory a look so cold it could have frozen the Chicago River. Do I look like a man who cares about your policies? No, sir. Right away, sir. Gregory practically bowed, sprinting out of the room. Vincent turned back to Lydia and gestured gracefully to the empty chair directly to his right, the seat of the second-in-command. Sit, Lydia Monroe, Vincent said softly. Lydia looked at the chair. Sitting down at that table meant crossing a line she had sworn never to cross again. It meant stepping back into the dark, violent world her father had died trying to escape. But looking into Vincent's eyes, she knew she had no choice. She had revealed her hand. The ghost of her past was awake, and the most dangerous man in the city was holding the leash. Slowly, Lydia untied her apron, draped it over the service station, and walked toward the table. As she sat down in the leather chair beside the Mafia Boss, she felt the heavy, suspicious glares of Gideon and Felix on her back. But Vincent Hayes just poured her a glass of the vintage Bordeaux himself, a gesture of respect that made the entire room hold its breath. Let us begin, Vincent said, looking right at her. And just like that, the waitress became the voice of the Yakuza. The atmosphere in the obsidian room had completely transformed. The raw electric tension of an impending execution had settled into a heavy, calculating quiet. Lydia Monroe sat rigidly in the oversized leather chair to Vincent Hayes's right. The crystal wine glass in front of her remained untouched. Her focus was entirely on the men across the table, her mind desperately categorizing the shifting alliances, the aggressive posturing, and the concealed weapons she could spot beneath the tailored Italian suits of Dominic Rossi's crew. Tell him, Dominic growled, snapping his thick fingers to draw Lydia's attention. He leaned forward, his heavy cologne momentarily masking the scent of the rain outside. Tell Mr. Hayes that the Chicago O'Hare Logistics Union won't process his shipments if my family doesn't get 40% of the Southport import tariff. And we want absolute unmonitored access to Warehouse 4B. My boss, Rocco Cavallaro, insists on it. We are not tourists in our own city. Lydia did not immediately translate. She turned the words over in her mind, recognizing the blunt, suicidal disrespect in Dominic's phrasing. Rocco Cavallaro was a heavy hitter in the local mob, but making demands of the Kansai syndicate's Oyabun was like demanding rent from a hurricane. She turned to Vincent. He was watching her. Not the men across the table, but her. His ice-blue eyes tracked the micro-expressions on her face, studying her process. The Italian asserts that their union connections at O'Hare are necessary for your land transit. Lydia spoke softly in Japanese, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to Dominic's barking English. He asks for 40% of the tariff and requests access to Warehouse 4B. He invokes the name of his superior, Rocco Cavallaro, as a guarantee of their local authority. Vincent's lips curved into a dark, humorless smile. He leaned closer to Lydia, the scent of expensive cedarwood and cold danger wrapping around her senses. He did not ask politely, did he? Vincent murmured in the heavy Kansai dialect. Lydia's breath hitched, but she kept her gaze steady. No, Hayes, Sama. He phrased it as an absolute demand. And you softened his words to protect him. Vincent's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a lethal edge. Do you care so much for the life of a filthy street thug, little bird? I softened his words to protect your carpets, as I stated before, Lydia replied smoothly, refusing to back down. If you kill him now, Rocco Cavallaro will retaliate by striking your transport trucks on Interstate 90. It is a messy, unnecessary war over pride. You are a businessman, Hayes-sama. There is no profit in a blood feud over a warehouse. Gideon, standing just behind Vincent's shoulder, inhaled sharply. No one spoke to the Oyabun like that. No one dared to correct his methods or analyze his strategies. Felix shifted his weight, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered gun, waiting for the command to drag the insolent waitress out into the alley. But Vincent did not give the order. Instead, a spark of pure, unadulterated fascination ignited in his eyes. He reached out his large, calloused hand, lightly brushing against Lydia's trembling knuckles as they rested on the mahogany table. The touch sent a violent jolt of electricity straight up her arm. "Tell the barking dog," Vincent said, never breaking eye contact with Lydia, "that he will accept 20%. He will never set foot near Warehouse 4B. If he or his men attempt to bypass my security, I will sever their hands and mail them to Rocco Cavallaro in a silk-lined box." Lydia swallowed hard. She turned her attention back to Dominic, slipping seamlessly back into English. "Mr. Hayes is willing to offer a generous 20% tariff," Lydia said, her tone professional, projecting a confidence she absolutely didn't feel. "However, Warehouse 4B is strictly off-limits to all external personnel due to proprietary syndicate assets. Furthermore, Mr. Hayes expects total compliance regarding port security. Any unauthorized access will be considered a hostile breach of the treaty." Dominic's face darkened, a vein pulsing at his temple. 20% of that's an insult. Rocco will never sign off on that. "It is not an offer, Mr. Rossi," Lydia said, leaning forward slightly. She wasn't just translating anymore. She was mediating, drawing on every survival instinct she had honed in the Osaka underworld. "It is the final parameter. You are dealing with an international conglomerate. 20% of Mr. Hayes's volume is worth triple what you are currently making at the East Docks. You walk out of here with a fortune, or you walk out of here with nothing. The choice is yours." Dominic stared at the young waitress, completely derailed by her authoritative posture. He looked at his own men, Carmine and Angelo, who subtly nodded. The math made sense. Even at a reduced percentage, the sheer scale of the Japanese syndicate's operation would flood their accounts with cash. "Fine," Dominic spat, leaning back in his chair. 20%, no access to 4B, but I want the agreement in writing. My lawyer needs to see the transit documents by tomorrow morning." Lydia turned to Vincent, translating the capitulation. Vincent nodded slowly, a triumphant gleam in his eye. He reached into his breast pocket, retrieving an elegant silver Montblanc fountain pen. He slid a heavily embossed leather portfolio across the table toward Dominic. "The treaty is concluded," Vincent said in Japanese, though the finality in his tone transcended the language barrier. As Dominic uncapped his own pen to sign the documents, Lydia let out a slow, silent exhale. She had done it. She had successfully navigated a high-stakes mafia negotiation without a single bullet being fired. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the crushing weight of the adrenaline finally beginning to recede. But as she opened her eyes, her gaze caught a subtle, terrifying reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, in the rain-slicked alleyway adjacent to the restaurant, a black, unmarked cargo van had quietly rolled to a stop. Its headlights were off, and through the distorted water-streaked glass, Lydia saw the unmistakable silhouette of an assault rifle barrel sliding out of the side window, aiming directly at the center of the obsidian room. Directly at Vincent Hayes. Time slowed to an agonizing crawl. The logical part of Lydia's brain calculated the trajectory. The van was parked precisely at an angle that bypassed the reinforced steel frames of the restaurant's architecture. The glass was thick, but it wasn't bulletproof. Dominic Rossi hadn't just come to negotiate, he had come to orchestrate an assassination. The argument over the warehouse was a stalling tactic, a way to keep Vincent sitting in a fixed position until the hit squad arrived. Lydia didn't think. The traumatic muscle memory of her youth hijacked her nervous system. "Get down!" Lydia screamed in Japanese, her voice shattering the quiet sophistication of the room. She lunged sideways, throwing her entire body weight against Vincent's broad chest. The sheer surprise of the attack knocked the syndicate boss out of his heavy leather chair. They hit the plush carpet just as the world exploded. A deafening roar erupted as high-caliber automatic fire tore through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The torrential rain outside seemed to mix with the flying shards of crystal glass, shredding the curtains and turning the beautiful mahogany dining table into splinters. Above them, chaos reigned supreme. Dominic roared a command in Italian, flipping the remains of the table to use as a barricade. His men, Carmine and Angelo, drew their weapons, but they weren't aiming at the window, they were aiming at Gideon and Felix. The room devolved into a claustrophobic, deafening war zone. Gideon moved with terrifying precision, taking a bullet to his left shoulder, but returning fire, instantly placing a fatal shot right between Angelo's eyes. Felix vaulted over the service station, his blade flashing as he engaged Carmine in brutal close-quarters combat. Beneath the wreckage of the table, Lydia was pinned under the crushing weight of Vincent Hayes. The syndicate boss had instantly rolled, placing his own heavily muscled body between her and the shower of bullets tearing through the room. Vincent's face was inches from hers, his ice-blue eyes wide, but entirely devoid of panic. He was in his element. The civilized veneer of the billionaire venture capitalist was completely gone, replaced by the lethal calculating Oyabun. "You saw the van," Vincent stated, his voice a low, steady rumble amidst the gunfire. It wasn't a question. "Sniper. South Alley." Lydia choked out, coughing as plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. "Rossi stalled you. It was a setup." Vincent's jaw locked. He drew a custom matte black Sig Sauer from his waistline. "Stay exactly here, little bird. Do not move." Before Lydia could protest, Vincent surged upward. He didn't cower behind cover. He moved with the predatory grace of a phantom, stepping right into the crossfire. Dominic, who was desperately trying to reload his weapon behind the shattered remnants of the table, looked up just in time to see the Japanese syndicate boss towering over him. "Rocco sends his regards," Dominic sneered, raising his gun. "I will give them to him personally," Vincent replied in flawless, chilling English. He fired twice. Dominic's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the carpet, lifeless. The gunfire from the alleyway abruptly ceased. A screech of tires echoed through the rain as the unmarked van realized the hit had failed and sped off into the Chicago night. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a faint, approaching howl that signaled the end of the isolation. The obsidian room was entirely destroyed. The chandeliers were shattered. The vintage Bordeaux was bleeding into the white carpets, and the metallic tang of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Gideon, clutching his bleeding shoulder, kicked Angelo's weapon away. Felix stood over Carmine, wiping a bloodied blade on his tailored slacks. "Secure the exits," Vincent commanded his men, his voice slicing through the ringing silence. "We vanish in 2 minutes. Bribe the police captain. I want this entire block scrubbed of our presence." Vincent turned slowly, his boots crunching over the broken glass. He walked back to where Lydia was slowly pushing herself up from the floor. Her hands were cut from the debris, her pristine white waitress uniform stained with soot and water. She was trembling violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting her system like a freight train. Vincent knelt in front of her. He ignored the sirens, the destruction, and his bleeding lieutenants. He reached out his large hands, gently gripping her face, forcing her to look up into his piercing blue eyes. "You saved my life," Vincent whispered in Japanese, the raw intimacy of his tone making Lydia's heart race in a completely different way. "Twice in one night. Once with your mind, and once with your body." I just reacted," Lydia stammered, her breath shallow. "I couldn't let them kill you." "No," Vincent agreed softly, his thumb gently wiping a streak of dirt from her cheek. "You couldn't. Because you belong to my world, Lydia Monroe. You tried to hide in plain sight, pouring water for ghosts. But your blood runs with the same fire as mine." He stood up, pulling her to her feet with effortless strength. He didn't let go of her hand. "Gideon," Vincent barked, switching to English. "The girl comes with us." Lydia's eyes widened in panic. "What? No. I have a life here. I have an apartment, a job." "You had a job," Vincent corrected, glancing around the ruined restaurant. "Now you are an accomplice to a mafia shootout. Dominic's family will pull the security tapes. They will see you saved me. Rocco Cavallaro will send his best men to hunt you down, skin you alive, and leave you in the Chicago River." Lydia froze. The cold, horrifying truth of his words washed over her. She had exposed herself. The quiet, invisible life she had built after her father's death was completely obliterated the moment she spoke Japanese. Vincent stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You have two choices, Lydia," Vincent murmured, his voice a hypnotic, inescapable command. "You can walk out the front door and take your chances with the Italians, or you can walk out the back door with me. Step into my syndicate. Stand by my side. I will protect you with every gun, every dollar, and every drop of blood at my disposal." Lydia looked into his eyes. There was danger there, a dark, consuming abyss that threatened to swallow her whole. But beneath the danger, there was a fierce, undeniable possession. He was offering her absolute protection, but the price was her freedom. She would become the right hand of the devil. The police sirens grew deafeningly loud, flashing red and blue lights painting the rain-streaked walls of the alleyway. Lydia looked at the shattered restaurant, then back at the ruthless, beautiful man holding her hand. The ghost of Osaka had finally caught up to her. "Let's go," Lydia whispered. Vincent smiled a true, devastating smile and pulled her into the shadows, vanishing into the night, just as the first police cruisers breached the perimeter. Did Lydia's bravery leave you breathless? If you loved this intense dive into the dangerous high-stakes world of Chicago's underground and the romance that defied all the rules, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this thrilling story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more heart-pounding mafia dramas, shocking twists, and forbidden love. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment from tonight's episode.